Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode.
We have a special offer for listeners. If you purchase Pattern Breakers, then you'll buy one and get one free for a friend with this link, patternbreakers.com/themilvet.
Today, I'm joined by Mike Maples Jr. and Peter Ziebelman, co-founder of the book Pattern Breakers. Both of these gentlemen have made significant contributions in the world of venture capital, specifically in the tech sector. Mike Maples Jr. is a renowned venture capitalist and the co-founder of Floodgate, a leading venture capital firm based in Menlo Park, with a background that includes successful investments into Lyft, Twitter, Okta, Twitch, Chegg, and Applied Intuition, along with many other fantastic startups. Peter Ziebelman is a distinguished instructor and co-founder of Palo Alto Venture Partners. He taught me when I was at Stanford, and I had the great fortune to actually listen to Mike talk about thunder lizards and much of the topics we'll talk about today. And he continues to lecture at Stanford Graduate School of Business and has helped students become better understanders and implementers of venture capital. Together, both are graduates of Stanford, and they've written the book Pattern Breakers, which was released July 9th. I've gotten a copy, and thankfully it's signed, and it says, "Thanks for being a co-conspirator." And we'll talk a lot about being co-conspirators today. Welcome, Mike and Peter.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here.
The first topics or set of topics I want to talk about is something that military veterans are going to definitely relate to, and that is around OODA, speed, and taking initiative. That's true in the military, and it seems like it might also be true in the startups. Is that the case or not?
For sure. So who should start?
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. I'll give it a try. So there was a Commander John Boyd, was a flight instructor in the military, and I think his nickname was something like 40 Seconds Boyd. He could beat anyone in a simulated dogfight. And he had a certain philosophy of fighting that he called observe, orient, decide, and act, right? The OODA loop. And the basic notion, and I hope I don't reveal my lack of military experience here, but here's my understanding of it, is that sometimes the way you win a fight is to decide more quickly and to move more quickly. So if you're a plane here and you're a Russian MiG and I'm an F-16 and I move, even if I'm wrong on my first move, if I make my next move before my enemy makes their first move, I can do two things. One is I can use the information of what I observed to orient myself and decide and act in a different new way. And I can disorient my opponent because my opponent thought I'm here, now I'm over here, right? And so the idea of OODA loops, as I understand it, is that sometimes you can win not just by being accurate, but by having such agility and dynamism to your approach that you can get inside of your enemy's decision loop and disorient them and beat them. And so when you think about startups, the exact same thing applies, right? And so if I can iterate much faster than my opponent, I can be wrong in the first iteration, but I can adjust based on what I learned from the real world and facts on the ground and then reiterate to a better place. And so John Boyd changed the art of war, right? The F-16 is not as fast in a straight line as a Russian MiG, but it changes direction faster. And so what Boyd understood was that fighting is not just about the plane, it's a mind and machine melding of the pilot in the plane, right? It was a philosophy of fighting that was optimized for the F-16 and its design decisions. And so for me, that, like, when you think about the lamp stack and startups and agile, that's like the equivalent of an F-16, and the agile startup founder is implementing OODA loop philosophies and how they go about business.
The other connection to the military is you often say don't fight fairly, at least in startups.
That's right.
Well, it's not a fair fight. Yes.
And I would love to kind of hear like how startups fight unfairly and win.
Yeah,
and I think that's the basis of the book.
That's right. So the thing that I think that a lot of people don't realize is that the status quo always starts out with the advantage. And so you got to decide whether you want to fight an unfair fight according to their rules, or do you want to refuse the premise of the rules and start a new way of fighting. And I suppose that a good example of this from war history, like I'm remembering it as we speak right now, but do you remember like Norman Schwarzkopf in the first Gulf War? And he kind of had this kind of, I forget what they call it, like the left hook move or something like
100%.
that. It's that kind of a thing, right? It's like your adversary is expecting you to act in one way, and you act in a completely different way, and you show up completely out of the blue, unexpected, and they don't know how to react to what you're doing because none of the assumptions about how the fight is going to take place are true anymore. And so the way startups win is not by being a better version of the present. They win by refusing the premise of the rules and showing up in a different way and waging a different fight that's unfair according to their advantages. And you can't be middle ground about this. If you're a startup, you have to choose to fight unfair according to your advantages, or the default will be that you lose in an unfair fight according to the incumbent's advantages.
Right. The basic setup is that it is an unfair fight. The incumbent has all the advantages, and the startup has very few, if any. And so it's an unfair fight from the start. And that's why the startup has to do something different. And I think, we talk about that iteration, Mike, but we talk about it, most people think of it in terms of iterating the MVP out in the customer's world. But I think in the book, we talk about how the iteration, even before you think of the MVP, talk about what we call an implementation prototype. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of things, right? Like in many ways, like some of the examples that we've even talked about so far, the battle is won before it even starts, because the framing of the battle is such that the person playing offense just has an overwhelming advantage, right? And when you start a startup, you have to attack with overwhelming force for what you have. And so one of the things that we recommend in the book is what Peter just mentioned, is the implementation prototype. You come up with ways to simulate the reality of the product to find desperate customers before you ship the actual real thing, before you raise a lot of money, before you build a minimum viable product. And by doing that, you can decide whether this idea is worthy of your time and talent before sort of crossing the Rubicon or launching an invasion with overwhelming force, right? You want to, so many metaphors here, hopefully not mixing too many, but like the Colin Powell theory, right? Don't launch an invasion unless you're positive you can win, that you have overwhelming force advantage. For us, like startups are a lot like that. A lot of people, they just do startups, and they realize 3 years in that it's not a big enough idea, that it wasn't worthy of their time and talent. And for us, that's the only real failure mode. The only way to fail is to lose your time, because you never get your time back. But what you want to do is instead frame the battle at the outset such that you're setting it up that you have an overwhelming advantage with overwhelming force, so that you've done all the advanced prep work, right, to figure that out before literally engaging in the real world.
The reference to the Powell Doctrine is so fascinating, because so much of the Powell Doctrine was centered around having a great exit strategy. And so many founders just stumble into like plan phase 1, phase 2, the beginning, but don't think, all right, what am I trying to achieve? What's my outcome? The fair fight thing and don't fight fair is fascinating, especially the Gulf War analogy used, because that's when Saddam fought fair. He was like, okay, I'll fight conventional with conventional. And that's the U.S. military strong suit. But our enemies who don't try to fight fair, we have a harder time with.
That's right.
And that's going to be the future, because like smart enemies will not fight fair.
Right.
Right. When we see what's happening with Ukraine and Russia now, it's definitely not a fair fight when you look at it. And Israel is clearly another example too.
Totally. And the interesting thing about the conflicts right now in Gaza and Ukraine is the use of modern technology and weaponry on the battlefield. And they're still fighting some conventional battles, but these days it's the heavy use of drones. And I think you've done some defense tech investing.
Yeah, and it's funny, we didn't necessarily set out to do it. So I've always been on the spectrum of investors. I'm pretty pro rah USA, patriotic. But I didn't necessarily have a military investing strategy, right? My dad was in Vietnam, and I've just always been sort of have an affinity for the U.S. military. But we did invest in a company called Applied Intuition that originally started out creating simulation software for autonomous vehicles, mainly cars. But what we started to realize is that drones and other types of military products are going to start to be impacted by autonomy and by software-defined technology. And so Applied Intuition started to have success in selling to those companies as well, and started to work with the government procurement agencies and start to develop a presence in Washington, D.C.
It feels like that is a space that has been moribund. Essentially, massive primes winning every single contract. But increasingly, we meet a ton of military veteran founders who want to start companies in that space. I'm curious, what, if any, advice do you have for them, given it's not like Chegg or Lyft in the sense of like B2C, but it's B2G?
It is, and in fact, the telltale I had is, as you know from the course, Tim, the students do a class project and form teams, and two of my teams were vets that did autonomous vehicles, and one in the water and amphibious, and the other one in the air, I guess is how you describe it. And seeing that trend is definitely there. I think there is, and I hope you don't mind this answer because it's a little controversial, but the natural inclination of the vet is to say, I know the government, I can sell back to the government. And I just met with a student who came up with that same viewpoint, and I said, well, that's great, and you've got a great idea, but selling back to the government is hard. And you've served your time. And this is an area that you may believe you know really well, and maybe you do have an advantage, and if you do, you should pursue it. But particularly because of our book and how we checkpoint whether you have are using inflections, have an insight. If you do not, think about selling to other areas of the world other than the government, because there are other areas to sell into that can be, frankly, a whole lot easier to do, and have a customer that has a cycle time that's much quicker. So again, I want to be clear, I'm not against selling back to the government, but this natural inclination that that's the only place you can go back and sell to, I think is really narrowing the fields of where a vet actually, in terms of their opportunities.
I love that. And I want to
I hope so,
I want to double click on that because we meet so many veterans who feel like they've been typecast a certain way, and so they proceed a certain way. And so much of the book, Pattern Breakers, is about pivots and how successful pivots can happen. And not a lot of people know, but there have been fantastic veteran founders, from Sam Walton of Walmart to Bob Parsons of GoDaddy, Ross Perot, that have done something that is completely different than what they did in the military. And so it's refreshing to hear a civilian say, hey, you don't have to always fall back on what you were doing in the military or selling to the government, because the DoD is 5% of GDP. And there's 95% of the GDP that you can go after too.
And it's a hell of a sales cycle too.
Yes.
I mean, it's not just government military, it's government schools. And Mike, you may have a different view. We haven't talked about this.
Yeah, well, I think that it's hard. So I'm not sure I disagree, but I think it's useful just play the other side of the argument just for completeness. Who has been successful in creating these new subprimes? It's been people like the Palantir guys, or it's been people like Palmer Luckey at Anduril. In the space arena, it's been people like Elon Musk. And so we talk in the book a lot about this notion of founder future fit. And I believe that you can succeed selling to the military, but you need a certain type of founder. And like, these founders are not super agreeable, normal, conventional types of dudes, right? Like Palmer Luckey is pretty out there, and like Elon Musk, and these companies end up suing the government, right? They're suing their own customer. And so it's like, you have to be willing to engage in behaviors that a lot of people are going to find off-putting, that a lot of people are going to say, that's just not me, that's not what I'm in it for. But part of pattern breaking is not just the pattern breaking ideas, it's the pattern breaking behaviors necessary to make the ideas real. And if you're Elon Musk and you start SpaceX, that's great, but you got to blast rockets into outer space, and you got to hire engineers that can do that, and you got to somehow find a way to compete against NASA or collaborate with them and sue the government when they don't award you contracts before you run out of money. And so, like, it's doable, But it's not just about knowing how to build the thing that needs to be built. There's a lot of glass you got to break and a lot of things you got to shake up to pull that kind of thing off.
Yeah, and I don't think we disagree. I think vets are natural for selling back to the government. It's just that doesn't have to be your only choice, is the point I was trying to make.
Exactly.
And I also think in terms of how they sell themselves, I don't know if you want to get here, Tim,
Please.
but I found that they were limiting themselves as well. And what we try to teach in Patent Breakers is to be disagreeable, you can take a path that maybe you weren't disagreeable during the military because that didn't get you far. But when I look at my youngest son, as you know, he's a helicopter pilot, and when I look at him, his world trying to get into the military, he had to be disagreeable. His teachers thought, that isn't the path for you. You should be going on to this other occupation or this other college, not try to get into the Naval Academy. He didn't get into the Naval Academy, but he did end up as a Marine through ROTC. And I just think if that person thinks about not just what they learned in the military, but what they learned to get into the military, they might be better served using those characteristics than just the ones that we hear so often. I was a great leader, I know about culture. That doesn't separate you necessarily as that 1 in 1,000 or that pattern breaker. Really think about what are those characteristics that separate you from the rest of the people applying for that job, whether it's as an entrepreneur or into a corporation. What are those qualities? And typically, even though leadership and developing a great culture, teamwork, those are great qualities, but other people have those. And you've got other qualities beyond that you probably use to get into the military.
The other thing that I find is sometimes a good thing to consider is a lot of people distinguish themselves in the military based on something they're already passionate about that maybe is independent of their military experience. So, like, I even remember my dad was in Vietnam, and he had been a young person at IBM. And so he convinced the military to get an IBM mainframe for their data center in Saigon. And they started counting the supplies and stuff, because back then all the supplies were in paper, and you order paper clips, you might get one paper clip or a pallet of paper clips or a box of paper clips. Who knows, right? Because the guy filling out the slip may say, yo mama, number of paper clips. Who knows, right? And so they started getting this computer to count all the supplies, and they'd saved all this money. They saved like $200 million or something. So Secretary of State McNamara comes out there, and my dad's like 23 years old, something like that, maybe a little over, 24, 25. And McNamara's like, hey, I want to see this guy. What did you do with all this saved money? And my dad doesn't, he's like, well, we just saved it, And he's like, oh, but it was like he was super passionate about computers, even though he's in the military. And I bet you that a lot of people are listening, there was something about their temperament that they were excited about that contributed to whatever success they had in the military that could extend to success in the private sector that has nothing really to do with the military per se, right? Just like you could work at IBM independently completely of the military after being in Vietnam, right? But I think that there's people benefit a lot, I think, by understanding where their natural talents have taken them before, because that ends up being a path to founder future fit, right? It ends up being a tell about where they're likely to find, a breakthrough in understanding.
Right, and I think, Mike, we even talked about some of the examples where the founders are literally obsessive on their idea. They're thinking about it at night, they're thinking about it when they wake up in the morning, and we know a lot of entrepreneurs that are obsessive, but it's that over the top that we've seen, not only obsessive, but they know the most about that area. I think you mentioned even Brian Chesky with Airbnb, how he literally studied the origin of hotels as he was forming Airbnb.
Yeah, and most of these founders will go to a degree of interest and attention to detail that will seem fanatical to most people. So they're not always the best party guests, because you think you're supposed to be talking about the Olympics and who won the gold medal in the sprinting competition, And that reminds them of the fact that they're doing autonomous vehicle simulation software. Somehow they draw a connection and they want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's always, they're thinking about it literally all the time, and they can't stop thinking about it.
And in the book, you talk about Airbnb and how they can't stop thinking about their company, and they show you cereal boxes. And the other thing that I found so interesting about your anecdotes around Airbnb is the humility of showing a deal that you passed. And there's a number of great venture books, but they're all about kind of like shoulder patterning, like, hey, like this is the deal I did and this is why I was successful. But I felt like more of the book was actually around how you missed Airbnb and how like you learned from that mistake. And I feel like that's so much of what the military tries to do too with after action reviews. Like, hey, what did we miss and why did we miss this and how do we get better?
Yeah, and I think Peter actually deserves a lot of the credit for this sort of flavor of it. So like when we would talk about startups and we would think about frameworks in his class, one of the things that I would always say is like part of what bugs me about all this, the way entrepreneurship is taught, is in my lived experience, it's just kind of wild, right? It doesn't really fit neatly into categories or frameworks or recipes. And so Peter was like, well, but that story needs to get out there, right? Like we need to convey that energy because that's the reality of it. Like
it's even better than that, because what Mike has found, particularly since he was in the room on the start of many of these companies, is the story changes. The popular story changes.
Totally.
And so you really need to go back and see someone who was really there to get the real story of what happened and then tell that. And it may not always be a Cinderella story, exactly as you've talked about. And although no one's shed a tear for Mike, he certainly did fine with many other companies. But the Airbnb story was definitely one that was a miss.
And it's funny how suggestions can cause you to miss things. So without going too into depth in it, so the prior week, a cereal company pitched us called Mojo Mix. And so they say you go online and you pick your cereal ingredients and then we package them up and we send them to you. And my partner, Ann, says to me after this meeting, why did we meet with a cereal company? This isn't our business. We've got no business doing this. It's not a technology company. I said, well, it's technology enabled. And she said, come on, we're supposed to find the next Twitter or the next Twitch, not this. So I said, okay, fair enough. And so the next week, Air Bed and Breakfast comes in. And we walk in the conference room and it's full of cereal boxes, Obama O's and Captain McCain Crunch. And Ann kind of looks at me like, what part of this conversation do we have a week ago that you didn't understand? And I'm looking at her like, I didn't know it's going to be cereal boxes, right? I thought it was Air Bed and Breakfast. So we get into this meeting and there's all these cereal boxes and he tries to sell us one. And he says, well, the reason we have them is this is the only way we've been able to fund the company. Which isn't totally confidence inspiring, right? And so would you like to buy one? They cost $40 or whatever. First mistake was to decline. And then he goes, okay, we're gonna show you the product now because we hear
that first mistake because they're collectors.
They'd be worth thousands of dollars now, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so then they say, well, the person who introduced us, Michael Seibel, who was a founder of Just TV, says, you don't like slides, you like demos. So we came in to demo the product. I'm like, great, exactly right. They fire up the product, it doesn't work, crashes, server's crashing. So we're sitting there, it's like 20 minutes into the meeting, we're just looking at each other, and I'm like, okay, why don't we just look at the slides? Well, we didn't bring slides because we thought you wanted to see the product. So we're like 20 minutes into the meeting, room full of cereal boxes, still no idea what Air Bed and Breakfast does. But it just goes to show you that you have to be awake to the possibility that it's going to end up being Airbnb, that it's going to be worth $100 billion someday. And so I would have, it drives me to drinking to think about how much we lost by not doing it. We would have made 6,000 times our money if we'd said yes to it. But thank goodness we said yes to a few good ones.
Well, there's also the anecdote of either you share in the podcast or I read it, and that is for Justin TV / Twitch. You realized that it was a success once they told you, hey, guess what? Amazon's buying us. And you're like, wow, that's a 85xer. And now I got to tell my limited partners that I've got a great exit.
Yeah, I'd forgotten I was a shareholder. So we invested in Justin TV, and then one day they send an email that says, great news, we've pivoted. We're two companies now, Social Cam and Twitch. I didn't understand what Twitch, what they're talking about. And social cam sounded like Vidi. So I was like, okay, the reason they did this is so that they could make some money on the company that matters. And then it sold to Autodesk a few months later for $65 million. I just thought that was the company. So I forgot I was a shareholder in Twitch. I didn't have it in my financials. So you're right. I had to explain to my LPs, hey, we just had this big windfall. I don't have it in any of my financial reports. Do I need to restate those? And fortunately, they were like, no, just send us the money. We're good. So it turns out that they weren't too upset about it.
One of the things that we focus on is investing in veteran founders. And what we have found really cool about Floodgate is that you all actually had invested in a veteran founder too, Mike Slog of Shift. And a lot of veterans have benefited from Shift. Unfortunately, it didn't go the way Mike and team and everyone wanted it to go. But it's really cool to see not just, I would say, small funds like us investing in veteran founders, but also bigger funds like Floodgate.
Yeah, and we've had, Applied is looking good, but there's another one we invested in called GuideOn, where the idea was to use machine learning and big data. That they had cataloged every single job description in the military, and had tried to come up with a way to translate those jobs to the skills that would be a likely match to jobs in the private sector. And we thought, okay, well, let's go do deals with all the HR departments of all the Fortune 500 companies, because a lot of them had initiatives to hire veterans. But it's just like, sometimes it's a great idea and it just isn't meant to be. It just doesn't work for whatever reasons. It takes too long, costs too much money, and we just couldn't get there. But it was like it was a great, we lost money, but it was a great experience, right? Those founders are great. We still stay in touch, and can't win them all.
And speaking of pivoting and military pivots, but there's startup pivots. And you wrote in the book, I think the line, 80% of some of your best returns have come from companies that have pivoted. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and when you cast it through the lens of the OODA loop, it makes complete sense, right? So like a pivot basically says, I'm willing to not be attached to the first idea being precisely right. What I'm really trying to do is get a first mover advantage into the future, and I need to have a fundamental insight about the future. So like a good example of a pivot would have been Lyft. It started as Zimride, and it was a corporate commuting service. And then the iPhone 4S comes out, and they're like, wow, it's got this new GPS chip in it. We could do peer-to-peer ride sharing. We could go straight to the end game, all the way to the consumer. And so that was a pivot. But another way to think about what they did was they observed, they oriented, they decided, and they acted. And they acted in the correct direction. And so, like, a lot of people think of a pivot as, either a mulligan because it failed, or what you do when you fail. But another way to look at pivot is, you don't run out of business when you run out of money. You go out of business when you run out of iterations. And you're always iterating, and you're always iterating in a very intentional way, in a very agile way. And so, like, when you look at it that way, it totally makes sense that most of the exit profits would come from pivots, right? Because your first strategy is unlikely to be precisely right.
And what we're seeing, and we also cover this in the book, is not only you're pivoting, but that's where the word pivot comes from. It's pivoting around something. And we're saying it pivots around your insight. That's what you should look for, is does that company, does that founder have an insight? And then the implementations are up to whatever customer base they find that ends up allowing them to get a foothold, cross the chasm, et cetera. But it's that insight that's most important. And that's what we're trying to do in the book, Tim, is to make sure that vets and others know the language to even talk about the idea, even before it gets to the MVP and other language that they're familiar with from great books like Lean Startup and 4 Steps to the Epiphany. But making sure they have that insight is really an important step. And in fact, even before that, making sure they understand what inflections they're using to power their idea is just as important as well. And those are 2 concepts we bring out pretty early in the book.
Yeah.
I think the book is so valuable for veterans for all the themes that we've talked about, but also because of what you just said, Peter, and that is the vocabulary. So much of what veterans lack when they transition is not having similar vocabulary. In the military, you have OODA, METTC, everything is an acronym. And in the business world, in many ways, it is too. And just reading these books, understanding what people are talking about and being able to use the same words is really important.
But it's even better than that, Tim, because a lot of vets I talk to say, I'm going to go into this industrial area because I don't have a background in tech. I'm not as competent in this new tech as some other people. I tell them, why don't you lean into that? Why don't you go where the newest area is? Because you'll have the same advantage of that student that is just learning at the same time. So if there's an AI in, some sort of domain that is brand new, you'll get up to speed just as quickly as the other people. So what we're doing with this language, just to be clear, it's new language. So it's not just them catching up with their classmate next to them that went to, already did a startup or already worked for a venture company. If they get up to speed, they're going to be right even with these, if not ahead of them, if they really get into the book. So I just want to make it clear that vets don't have to think about themselves as behind when they're in business school. They should think about having an advantage they already have, and then have the freedom to go anywhere their classmate is going, pretty much, unless there is something in their background that they can use to their advantage, or that classmate is using to their advantage. And we do say that in the book, this idea that Mike talked about of living in the future. Think about and maybe we want to get into that a bit more, because I think this is one of the tangible steps that a vet can take to prepare themselves, whether it's at a larger corporation or to do a startup, to think about how are they going to set themselves up to build a breakthrough. And that's by living in the future. Mike?
Yeah, and it might be like, I'm just thinking if we zoom out for just a second, earlier we talked about you don't want to fight fair, right? And so we're bringing up some language here to talk about, okay, so given that that's true, how do you fight unfair as a startup? Like what does that specifically mean? And I think that what we concluded was that there's three things that you can harness. One is inflections. And an inflection is a external change event that creates the opportunity to empower people in new ways. So like when the iPhone 4S came out, it had a GPS locator chip. For the first time, you could locate people with an algorithm. And then you have what's called an insight, which is where the creativity of the founder comes in. So like inflections happen with or without us, right? They just happen. Whereas the insight was, oh, that means you could do Airbnb for cars. And so they had to have the creative understanding to connect the dots. Oh, if I can locate riders and drivers with algorithms, I can do the same thing that Airbnb does with hosts and guests.
And that's what separates your idea from the 1,000 others that are trying to be pitched at that time.
And this is why insights are so important, because the original insight, Airbnb for transportation, was true, but it became true with a capital T once you had that iPhone 4S, right? Like the Zimride service couldn't be as robust as what Lyft could be. So the insights are really important in that a lot of people think that a startup is about the first product, and the first product matters for sure, but the insight is the truly important thing, right? Because the insight is what you're investing in as a founder. Yeah.
And you see how that's how it explained pivots. That was it was our surprise moment where we were saying, yeah, that's why pivots work. It's because it's the same insight usually, but it's a different implementation of that insight in the real world. And when you think about it that way, then you don't get wedded to the specific product because your insight is so strong.
And when you realize that insights are what define these outlier startups, it starts to explain a lot of things that vexed us for a long time. So for example, Google was one of 30 search engines. Why were they successful? It's because looking at it at the level of abstraction of a search engine is the wrong level of abstraction. Google had an insight. PageRank was a fundamental insight that varied from all other ways that search had been done before. So if you look at the world through the lens of insights, it will cause you to do two things. It will cause you to discard ideas that sound plausibly good that aren't that good, but it will also cause you to protect ideas that sound like they're not going to work, but they may be the right kind of crazy. And so the insight is the unit of interest, right? That's the thing that lets you know if you have a valid opinion about the future that goes against the way people are doing things right now.
And I don't know if you realize this, Tim, but Mike's sharing his valuable VC detector secrets with you now, because this works for investors as well, is how do you evaluate that entrepreneur that comes up with this crazy idea that you don't know is just a crazy idea or is it the next extraordinary idea? You really don't know. But if you ask questions like, what's your insight, rather than just fixate on what the product is like, then you might, at least, you won't necessarily know for sure, but you'll get an inkling that this might be something more than just a crazy idea because there's an amazing insight behind it.
Yeah, and then to kind of close the loop on, Peter kind of introduced this idea of living in the future, right? And so a lot of people are like, okay, well, where do insights come from in the first place? How do I get one? And what we've found is that the most durable cheat code is to live in the future. And so
we should explain that, though.
Yeah, so William Gibson, the cyberpunk author, said the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so if you look at, say, Daphne Kohler started Coursera, right, with
on this campus.
Yeah, and it was one of the co-founders, and it was on this campus, and they were delivering courseware online, using broadband, and they were living in the future, right? And so a lot of times what'll happen is you'll find the pockets of the future visit certain people before it visits the rest of us. Mark Andreessen, when he was a student at the University of Illinois in a supercomputer lab, Bob Metcalf, when he was at Xerox PARC inventing the Ethernet, all of them are living in the future. They're tinkering with what's new about it. And it's in their tinkering with it that they realize how this new technology changes the way people think, feel, and act in the future. And they encounter difficulties in the future because not everything's built yet. And so they build what's missing in that future, and that's where the insights come from.
And one of my favorite parts in the book is where we point out many of these entrepreneurs are not trying to build the next big thing. They're just trying to solve a problem that they have in the future. And so what if we flip that, Tim? Instead of the vet saying, I need to build the next big thing, I need to think of a product, I need to move to it quickly. What if they just chill for a moment and say, what if I lived in the future first? Just explore, this is an area that I'm psyched about, it's drones or it's ready-to-eat meals or whatever, but explore that area, get into it way deep, which they know how to do as vets, get into it way deep, and then maybe they'll find something that's missing there. Maybe they'll have an idea, or maybe they'll meet somebody there who has that big idea and they join up with that person. Living in the future is really a gateway to that next step of discovering something that's a true breakthrough. And that's something that we feel is pretty important for entrepreneurs and particularly vets to understand.
I want to provide an analogy, and this might be too much of a stretch, but Mike and Peter, you all invest in founders, and you all have found through your investments, and you've written this in the book Pattern Breakers, that founders will make pivots. And because of that, I think you all have a tremendous amount of founder empathy of, hey, sometimes that won't work, but the unit of the value is that insight. And we meet a lot of, an analogy I have is we meet a lot of veterans transitioning, and we oftentimes see them eventually succeed, but it's because they go through all these pivots too. And we tell every transitioning veteran we meet, you need to give yourself permission to explore and permission to fail. And in many ways, that permission is go to the future and go figure out what it is that you might want to do. Is that a fair analogy?
It's a fair analogy, but we think it's kind of expensive to do all that at the product stage, which is what I used to teach, what is pretty common. What we're saying in the book is, go ahead and do those MVPs and iterate on the customer. But before you even get there, why not iterate on the thoughts behind it? Why not iterate on, do you have inflections that are powering your idea? Why not iterate or discover whether you truly have an insight, something that you know to be true that others do not know to be true? And that's another thing we mentioned in the book. If you've got this idea and all your buddies are agreeing with you, saying, yeah, that's a great idea. If your venture capitalist is saying, yeah, go do that, maybe it's not a special insight that you think it is, because if everybody's agreeing with it, maybe it's not that unique. So that's another counterintuitive point we bring out in the book is if you have this great idea, one way to know that it's potentially really big is to have more than a few people disagree with you along the way.
There's that 2x2 matrix in the book.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is a a lot of people frame startups as, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to start this, I either succeed or fail. And if I fail, I have a failure. But another way to look at it is to try interesting things where you're not attached to success or failure. And so a lot of, like Wozniak built the Apple computer when Apple wasn't a company. He was working at HP, and his initial instinct was to try to give it to HP. But HP's like, well, why would we want one of these? This is just a toy. And so, but like when Woz was tinkering with the technologies that underlie the original Apple computer, he wasn't attached to success or failure. It's like when little kids play in the yard, right? And they're kicking the soccer ball around. They're not trying to win necessarily. They're just playing. And I think that a lot of the really great startup ideas, the idea comes from the person playing with something that's interesting to them for its own sake.
And that's something that we found in Stanford Business School. Again, not to be critical, but it's just a fact. There's this focus on, I want to do a startup. I want to have an idea. I got to get to that idea as quickly as possible. I got to raise money, and then I have to have $1 million a month run rate to raise the next round. And that's really forcing the issue, we believe. And this creativity that Mike talks about. In fact, even the Airbnb story, right?
Yep.
You were saying they were doing bed and breakfast to raise money to live so that they could then
In
think
San
of it.
Francisco,
They
the rent.
couldn't afford rent, and it's like they're like, we want to do a startup, but we got to be able to spend enough. We need to raise enough money so that we can rent this apartment. So they do bed and breakfast to raise money so that they can do the real startup idea. But it never occurred to them that bed and breakfast was the idea, was the thing. And by the way, the same was true with Netscape. So Andreessen graduates from the University of Illinois, and he gets a job, just like at a random software company. And Jim Clark leaves Silicon Graphics, and he hears that there's this smart kid named Mark Andreessen. He hooks up with him, and they spend months figuring out, are we going to do chips for video game machines? Or we're going to do, like, they had all these different ideas. And the last idea standing was the browser. And so they're like, well, we don't know how to charge money for it, but I mean, I guess we might as well do this thing. It's the only thing left. It's the thing. And so a lot of times we find that that's the case, and when you think about it, it makes sense because all breakthroughs by definition haven't happened yet. And so there can't be a recipe for a breakthrough. There's a mindset that leads you more likely to a breakthrough. And that mindset has to do with exploring things that you're more interested in than anybody else for its own sake. And that's where what we found is where most of the insights come from. And by the way, that's true not just in entrepreneurship, but when you study great scientists or artists or people who've had these creative breakthroughs, time and time again, you hear the eureka moment. You hear of Archimedes in the hot tub saying, "Eureka! I've discovered displacement." You hear of, the apple falling on Isaac Newton's head, and they asked Newton one time, "How is it that gravity occurred to you when the apple fell on your head?" And he told the person at the party, "It's because I thought about it all the time." And that's the truth, right? That's where the breakthrough. They seem to come in a flash. But they come in a flash because your subconscious mind is thinking about it when you're asleep. It's like your mind is just churning on it all the time in every different combination that it possibly can.
And we're not saying that you should just go play instead of work. We're not suggesting that. But we are saying that if you keep your mind prepared for this, and that's an important part of this, is that you should be prepared to be open and notice these things when they happen. Because a lot of folks are too, frankly, determined to build their next big company that they stop noticing as much. But if you can notice and be prepared, then, and it may be a little bit of luck, but I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of these extraordinary breakthroughs happen because people have immersed themselves in the idea without necessarily saying, this is going to be the next billion-dollar product.
Yep.
There's three major themes in the book. One is inflections, insights, and I think the third one we've been talking about a fair bit, and that's, I think you all call it founder startup fit.
Founder future fit.
Yeah.
Founder future fit. And the theme
We made that up.
And it's a great phrase because you all have been talking about the theme of not tying yourself to success or failure. And I feel like the only way you can do that is if you really believe in the future, you see the future, and you're like, I'm going to work on the future.
Yeah, it's not founder product fit.
Yes.
It's founder future fit.
So founder future fit is really about authenticity. And it's so like if you think about like Justin Kahn when he starts Justin TV, terrible idea, right? Live 24/7 broadcast of his life. Thank God they pivoted to Twitch, right? But if you look at it through an authenticity point of view, Justin Kahn wanted to be internet famous before there was a word for influencer. And you know, like we talked about applied intuition earlier, Kasser Yunus is a mature grown-up guy with like kids and like a family and like a semi-normal life. He's just not going to broadcast his life 24/7. And so like if you imagine anybody who would be from central casting to do that particular idea, it would have been Justin Kahn. And you realize in hindsight how powerful that was, because if you're living in a future that resonates with you, that you're intrinsically motivated by, you're more likely to notice important things about it. But you're also more likely to attract believers to your cause because they'll see your authenticity and they'll see that you're right. Whereas and then at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're Kasser Yunus and you're talking to a big car company or a military company and you're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars, like you're looking across the table at the CEO of that company, like that CEO needs to look you in the eye and think this guy can do the job. And Kasser's like, okay, well, I have half of the team from Tesla self-driving, and I've got some of the best engineers in the world from these different pockets at the cutting edge. And I came from, my founder and we came from Google, you know, Google Maps and Waymo. And so that team is from central casting to pursue that future. And so, and we talked earlier about like Elon Musk, if you're going to do rockets, if you're going to start a rocket company, that's cool, but you got to be a certain type of person to pull that off, right? Not anybody is going to just go start a rocket company. You got to know about more than just rockets. And so the matching of the founder to the future that they're pursuing and the authenticity of that match we found was really important.
And for really quickly on Palmer Luckey and Elon Musk, it helps that they had sold Oculus to Meta and PayPal. And so they have the ability to say, I can disregard conventional thinking.
That's right. And you have to be a miraculous, insanely great fundraiser, right? And you have to be willing to put all of your net worth to risk like Elon did, right? So your risk profile has to be different. Your ability to persuade people has to be different. And that's fine. Like anybody can sign up for that, but that's a lot to sign up for.
Right. But it's not the only way. It's not to say, you know, like the Airbnb founders or the Zimride guys, they didn't come in necessarily saying, I've already conquered the world and here's my next act. In fact, what we noticed, and I think Elon Musk is perhaps the exception, the reason founder future fit makes sense is you really probably only have one future that you fit into. And that's why you built that huge company, or even maybe a smaller company. But that's the one you fit into. And that's why Mike talked about authenticity, is we found so often that somebody says, oh, I need to do AI for this, but their future really doesn't fit that. And so it's a force fit, so to speak, and it doesn't work. And so what we're advocating is when you think about founder future fit, is to be true to yourself. It doesn't mean you've already done it, but be true to yourself as to what future you could go after, you could align yourself with. Maybe you have a buddy that's involved in X and she is an expert. Maybe you can learn from her that this is what your next future should be. And we give a couple examples, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate about Justin Kahn is how willingness to be open he is, right? So they had this incredible success with Twitch, and now after Twitch, he's this celebrity founder. Everybody wants to fund him. And he starts this company called Atrium, which was intended to streamline legal processes, and everybody, when they heard the idea, they're like, this makes total sense. I could see why that would be a big business. I can see why Justin could pull this off. He raised tons of money and then failed. And one of the problems that Justin is candid about is he's like, I'm just not interested in the legal profession. I'm just not interested. I'm not interested in the customers. I'm not interested in the content of it. He's just like, I just don't like it. And it's like, it's hard to be great at something you don't like very much. And what had happened was Justin cared more about his being a high status founder, right? He wanted to be a high status founder more than just the co-founder of Twitch. He wanted to be in the echelon of Brian Chesky and Patrick Collison. And, he lost sight of like why startups are successful. He lost that sense of authenticity, right, to the idea he was pursuing.
And we see a similar mismatch for many of the students coming out of at least Stanford Business School, where they're determined to do a startup, they're determined to make some money, and they really don't have this fit. And as Mike talked about, therefore they don't have the passion, the obsessiveness that you need to really make a success. And we're saying it may not be a huge monetary success, but it'll be something you love and appreciate and contribute to that is worthy of your time. And so when we talk about the book, it's not just about billion-dollar successes. It's about this fit to make sure you're leading the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years of your life these days with a startup that you're excited about and that you have a fit to. And that's different than doing a startup just because everybody else is or because you felt this is something that you were destined to do.
Well, I have a personal anecdote to connect what you just said. So WeWine 12 years ago, I'm sitting in a classroom not too far from here, and you and John Glenn are the instructor, and you're a guest speaker. And I have no idea about startups in Silicon Valley. I'm just new here. I'm a veteran. I'm just like, okay, what is this thing about, PayPal and Facebook? Mike comes and talks about thunder lizards. And I've never forgotten
Technical
that phrase.
term. Yeah.
And it was like, and it's like thunder lizards, thunder lizards, thunder lizards. And this was, I think, before even the phrase unicorns came about. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, people talk about startups as they use terms like disruptive or discontinuous or terms like that. And that's fine. I'm a huge fan of Clay Christensen. Don't get me wrong. But it kind of comes back to this point that I made a little bit ago, which is, in my experience, startups are kind of wild. They're like capitalist mutations when they work. And so I was searching for a term, a metaphor that kind of captured this idea of a capitalist mutation. And so the metaphor of a thunder lizard comes from Godzilla. So Godzilla was hatched from radioactivated atomic eggs and swam across the ocean, emerging with an attitude, and then starts to breathe fire onto things and eat train cars like they're sausage links and start to swipe holes in buildings and stuff. And to me, that was always the metaphor of a great startup. And my job, I have a particular set of skills. My job is to identify that thunder lizard when it's still in the atomic egg, right? So I'm a hunter of these atomic eggs. And I don't even always 100% know what's going to pop out of it, right? Like maybe it's going to look like a Godzilla creature. Maybe it's going to look like a pterodactyl. Maybe it's going to look like one of those ichthyosaurus, huge prehistoric fish. I don't care as long as it's big and as long as it, changes the rules and forces people to react to what they're doing.
And what we borrowed for the book is to give ownership is the idea of chaos at that very start and the idea that inflections do cause some chaos in the world that does give you a potential advantage, that maybe you notice what's happening with this inflection quicker or more insightful than anybody else, and that you're able to then, while the incumbent is worried about chaos and trying to tamp down chaos, just like a thunder lizard, you're able to thrive on chaos, if not create it, and end up, world domination or whatever story you want to say.
No, the problem, though, is that most people don't think about startups through that metaphor, right? So what the way most people think about startups when they're taught entrepreneurship is, I was told that I need to go find a big market. So, okay, energy, climate, huge problem. I want to go do a climate startup. So they do an assessment of the market for climate, and they sub-segment it, and then they look for
pain points
in the market and white space in the market and gaps in the market.
Be careful, Mike. This is what I taught Tim 13 years ago.
And they say, hey, I want to deliver there's unserved markets with underserved customers. I'm going to build the thing that serves those people. And they set out to build that thing. And the point that we're making in Pattern Breakers is that the problem with that is the founder doesn't realize they're unwittingly buying into a context, which is the current definition of the market. So they're unwittingly deciding to compete by the rules that have already been established by the incumbents. And so even if they're successful, and many are, their upside is going to be limited by the amount of space that the incumbency makes available to them to fill. Whereas what you want is unbounded upside, right? You're not interested in the total available market. You're interested in the total future market. And you want to have a product that defines the market. And the way you have a product that defines the market and creates a new category is you follow inflections, right? And so it's like the thing that makes those eggs atomic is the radioactive, right, is the inflection. And what you want to find is an inflection that offers enough empowerment that it can define entirely new markets. But when you show up, you're the category king of a new category, and you set the rules, and you define the language, and you say how things happen in this territory, right?
And then once you've done that, then you can cross the Rubicon, make your product, do the custom development, and all the good things I taught you back then. But I literally, Tim, have changed the way I've taught by including this ideation step before you even think about MVP, is to start thinking about inflections, insights, and living in the future, so that you do have something that has more powerful forces than you could ever imagine if you did the alternative of going straight to the MVP.
Yeah, so like one of my great friends, right, in the business, Steve Blank, right, we talked about him earlier with OODA loops and stuff, and John Boyd, I mean, he was the person who told me the story. He talks about getting out of the building, and that's exactly right. You also want to get out of the present, right? And that's the thing that we learned was that, the great ideas come from living in the future before other people do. And you find those different futures by finding powerful inflections that are powerful enough to change the future in the first place.
I want to talk about super builders real quick, because you also talk about that, and that's something that people
It's
can.
very important. Yeah,
and
it's a
people,
good topic. Yep.
It's very much related to future founder or founder future fit.
Yes.
How do you become a super builder?
That's a really good question. Most of the people I know who are super builders, they're just tremendously creative, talented hackers. And what is a super builder? To me, a super builder is a person who can literally build anything that's required in the moment for the startup to succeed. And the reason that matters is that startups are so uncertain that it's hard to know what's going to need to be built, right? So Airbnb had to build a payment system, and they had to scrape Craigslist, or they had to do all kinds of things that you would have never anticipated. Kyle Vogt, when he was at Cruise making robo-taxis, I mean, you're making cars that drive themselves. And so the super builder, the thing that I think is obvious is that they can build anything. The thing that's less obvious is they need to have faith. They need to have faith that no technical challenge is too high for them to overcome. And so that's a little bit of a temperament and a determination.
And it may be a different book. Yeah, I don't think we've really taught how to do it. But I think we would take away from the book, though, the idea of teaming up with a super builder.
Yeah.
And making sure, either if you're an investor or if you're a vet looking to join a team, does it have a super builder? Now, you may be that super builder, and that'd be amazing. But if you're not, does that team have a super builder? And that's something we checkpoint in the book.
Yeah.
Another theme is co-conspirator. And so you can be a super builder, but you also need co-conspirators. And you all talk about co-conspirators can take many forms. And one of them is an investor. Mm-hmm. Can you all talk about that?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Let me give it a try. Because at that early stage, it's so important to have an investor that not only is on your side, but believes in what you're doing. And sometimes they take that first step, I'm on your side, but you're one of 10 or 15 bets in their portfolio, and you truly get that sense that, yeah, I'm showing up for the meetings, but I'm not a co-conspirator. I'm not one that actually believes or even asks you, what is your insight and how do I help you move it along? And so that's why we purposely use the word co-conspirator instead of just advisor or co-investor, is to really give that sense. One of the movies that Mike has referenced is Ocean's 11 in the book, where there's a team. Now, we're not suggesting that folks rob a bank, but we are suggesting that the idea of co-conspirators that team up in that movie is the idea that we're talking about. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that we picked that, because each had their own specialty, but were able to also fill in for the other guy. And to us, that marks the great, when you have a startup that has a team where the people can fill in each other's job, and respect each other's job, that's great, and particularly for the investor and also for the customer too. We also look at customers as co-conspirators as well. And that's another point we bring out in the book, is that you may find that there's a customer attracted to your company, but they're not actually into the insight that you're doing. They like what you're doing, or they maybe worked with you before, and they're trying to dilute your idea. You may actually decide, I don't want that customer right now. I want customers that believe in my idea, that they're actually co-conspirators. So you may fire that customer and turn to the customers that believe in your idea. And that's why we're using the term co-conspirator. It's a loaded term on purpose for that reason.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that I find interesting about co-conspirators is it's a different way of thinking about going to market. So most people, when they build their startups, they think of going to market, they think there's a bunch of customer prospects out there and it's a funnel. And I have a set of marketing programs and a budget, and I'm going to, define the right marketing mix to go target those customers and then progress them like leads through the funnel until some of them close. And this probably sounds familiar to a lot of people listening, right? Because some people might be like, well, of course, that's what marketing is, right? That's what go-to-market is. In startups, though, marketing is different. Marketing is animated by belief. So what the founder does is they say, we're living in a different future right now than the status quo. Most people think that the future will be an extension of the present. We disagree. We think that the future will be radically different from the present, that you can't reconcile the future that I'm envisioning with the present. Therefore, I need to move a set of people to that different future. And so how do I move people? Well, most people aren't ready to move. Most people don't want to move. I have to find the people who are prepared to believe what I believe. So these people who move with me, or the founder, aren't animated for practical reasons. They move for aesthetic reasons, right? They move because they are irresistibly drawn to that different future. They co-create the future with the founders. And so they're co-conspirators in the sense that they're all engaged in a subversive conspiracy theory to create a better future. And at first, co-conspirators are the minority of people because they're the subset of people who believe what you believe. But over time, the movement accumulates and accelerates, and what was once heresy becomes the conventional wisdom. The reason I like the term movement and co-conspirators is it reminds me a lot of social movements. So like civil rights, Martin Luther King says, I believe people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. There's no middle ground there. Either occupy the future he believes or don't. But like a movement then takes the grievances of a minority against the majority in the status quo, and it turns what's wrong about the status quo into a weakness that they have to apologize for. And then over time, people start to see the benefits of the new way of doing things. And so that's what you want to do when you start a movement, is you want to create a sense of grievance against the status quo among those co-conspirators ready to move with you.
And those co-conspirators, the ones that are going to take you, we talked earlier about the valley of death. They're going to take you across that valley of death. So many people have had trouble. They start their company, they get some venture money, and then they get their product out. But they've got a customer base that are not co-conspirators. They're people that they convince for whatever reason to sell their product. If they have co-conspirators, the co-conspirators will then bring on and help establish a wider base and cross that valley. And you may end up having a different pitch to that next group, but it's those co-conspirators that are going to take you to that next step. And if you dilute that, which is another, I think, counterintuitive lesson, this idea that normally you want to increase the breadth of your product and add features, and there's a real temptation to do that. Either, I think venture capitalists are blamed to do that as they advise their CEOs. Customers are blamed to do that. But if you create that what we call the curse of too many benefits in the book, actually I think that was a term borrowed from Andy Radcliffe, who also teaches here. Yep. If you have those too many benefits, you've diluted your purpose, and you've have a tougher mission, which I think will resonate with the vets out there, that you need to be single-mindedly focused on your mission. If it's diluted, you're going to lose. And this is something that I think occurs in entrepreneurship as well.
These are all great insights, and this is why I love the book, and this is why I highly encourage all of our listeners to pick up the book. This concept of early adopters and believers and co-conspirators is a theme in like crossing the chasm. But I think instead of early adopters, these are people who also live in the future with you, and they're like, hey, I see the future you're building. Let me build that future with you. I have some rapid fire questions to close this out. First is favorite movies and movies not referenced so far.
Movies?
Yes.
Well, war movie?
Any movie.
Longest Day is
Interesting.
definitely, because that was, for me, a movie that showed the big picture on D-Day and how also some counterintuitive things won the war, literally. And so I love The Longest Day. And in particular, it also happened to have, I think, every male actor that had a name in there that was famous. So it's just a great movie.
The Outlaw Josie Wales.
Oh, there you go.
I just like it.
Okay. Great. Favorite books, again, not referenced in here, so you can't use Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that really hurts Mike. I would say for me, if I can use it, is Crossing the Chasm. I think Jeffrey Moore did an amazing job of, and again, using language, something that we all kind of said, oh, that's an epiphany. I get that now. But he used language that was new that allowed us to even talk about that Valley of Death. So that's one I'd say.
I really like this book by David Deutsch, The Beginning of Infinity. And so David Deutsch basically has a very inspiring view of science and reason. And he basically says that, all knowable things can be known by us, and that we're at the beginning of infinity of knowing those things, but that we can find those things out. And that all conflict, failures in life are due to a lack of knowledge. Fear is due to a lack of knowledge. And that part of what's interesting about science, therefore, is a theory becomes the best explanation we know of right now. But we can always falsify that theory. We can never say that the science is settled. We can never say that we've absolutely found the truth. But the inspiring thing is that if you're an authentic truth seeker, you're always excited by the possibility of a better explanation. And we're at the beginning of infinity of finding them. I like that one.
I think it capsules Mike's optimism.
Yeah.
Mike is one of the most optimistic VCs I've ever met. So it's just.
But I just think I just think that the way he thinks about the world is really inspiring.
It's a growth mindset.
Very much so.
Favorite band, musician, type of music
Oh, this is embarrassing.
or song?
Well, why don't you go first on this one?
I like Don McLean's American Pie album a lot. So Bye Bye Miss American Pie, right? I could memorize when I was like 3 years old. And then I think the even better song that's less appreciated on it is Vincent, about Vincent van Gogh. But like when I listen to those songs, I just can't figure, I don't know how he figured those words out. I just don't know how he figured it out.
Well, this is embarrassing because this is what I would tell my kids, or my wife would say, don't say this. But Dolly Parton, when she sings, "If you're waiting on me, you're backing up," I just love the counterintuitive theme on that, like a lot of country songs have on that. So I hope that's okay.
No, Dolly's
That's
good.
great. Last question. Favorite leader and why? Or leaders. And they don't have to be American. They don't have to be present, historic. But I think this reveals a lot about people, their favorite leaders and why.
Go ahead on that.
I'll give it a try. So I'm going to say my dad, but for a counterintuitive reason. So my dad used to say to me, you shouldn't try to have too many heroes. And his view was that your life is a gift. You don't know how much time you're going to have. And that the best way you can honor the gift of your time is to do your best according to your own abilities. Because when you think about it, you can never do better than your best. And so that's different from saying be the best. But what I found inspiring about it always was that there's only one you in this world. And so if you're being your authentic best self, nobody can compete with you at what you're being good at. And so ironically, the path to being the best is to not be the best relative to others, but be the best relative to what you're capable of. And so what he used to say to me is the failure mode of having too many heroes is you try to model yourself after them, and it's a form of immaturity, if you will. And so it's like, it's good to respect the talents of people, and it's good to say, hey, I'd like to learn from that person. But like for him, it was a step slightly too far to hero worship somebody. And I kind of think that there's a lot to that.
Fascinating.
Well, you could say I'm a fan of war movies. And I know there's a mixed message with this selection, but I'll say it anyway, is a Patton. I just, particularly as he's portrayed as a hero, but one that gets in the fight, keeps on the aggressive, doesn't look back. Of course, he did things that he shouldn't be proud of, we shouldn't be proud of, but I think that's part of a leader is sometimes you end up being disagreeable to a bunch of people in the process of moving forward.
The Patton selection is fascinating for a few reasons. One is he studied his enemies, right? Like there's that famous scene in that movie. He's like, Rommel, I studied you. I knew exactly you would do this. You magnificent
all through
bastard.
history and
Yes.
studied the whole history. Yeah,
Yes.
he was just obsessive on it. And he also felt he had a purpose in life that,
He was very
maybe-
true to his authentic self.
yeah, maybe a little exaggerated in his own mind, but I just think for a leader, we just don't see people as much sticking themselves out there to do something exceptional. And that's what we're hoping the book does, is gives people, they don't necessarily need to create $1 billion company to get the worth of the book out. They just need to follow what they think, be true to themselves and do something worthy of their time. And I think Patton certainly did that.
Yeah, the other person I would just like to meet would have been Jesus. Because, I mean, just take religion out of it for a second. Like, everything about our Western world, like, emanates from a lot of the philosophical underpinnings that we now take for granted that he brought to this world that were not the assumptions, right? Talk about pattern-breaking ideas. And I mean, talk about a religion that got product market fit. It's Christianity, right? And
definitely.
So like that guy
Well,
was
he saw
one
the
heck,
future too, because
that
at the
guy-
time that wasn't.
He was one heck of a persuader,
Yes.
right? And so like, I'm just like, that guy would be interesting to talk to. I bet like he had an extra gear for sure. Whether you believe everything that he believes or not, like it's undeniable that guy had an extra gear.
And he also had people who helped him write the story. And there's a great line that you all use in chapter 13, those who tell stories rule society, Plato. And then to finish this off with Patton, he saw the future for American armor. So were it not for him, tanks and tank modernization would not have happened, and Americans wouldn't have been prepared for World War II. So he also saw the future. This has been an awesome podcast. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mike. Please
Our
pick up the
pleasure,
book,
Tim.
Pattern Breakers.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Tim. This was great.
We have a special offer for listeners. If you purchase Pattern Breakers, then you'll buy one and get one free for a friend with this link, patternbreakers.com/themillvet.